On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, the doors of every Templar commandery in France were broken down simultaneously. The arrests had been coordinated in secret for months, sealed orders sent to every royal official in every province to be opened at the same moment, so that no warning could reach the men inside before the soldiers arrived. It was one of the most precisely organized operations of state violence in medieval history, and it required the cooperation of an entire kingdom's administrative apparatus working in perfect secrecy toward a single end. By nightfall, hundreds of knights had been taken. The Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, was in custody. The treasurer, the commanders, the chaplains, the serving brothers, all arrested, all in chains, all facing charges of heresy, blasphemy, sodomy, and the worship of a demonic idol called Baphomet. The date, Friday the 13th, has given Western culture one of its most enduring superstitions. But the superstition obscures the reality. What happened on October 13th, 1307 was not the exposure of a secret society of devil worshippers. It was something far more interesting, far more modern, and far more relevant to the world we live in today. It was a sovereign debt crisis resolved by the elimination of the creditor. The King of France owed the Templars more money than he could ever repay, and the solution he chose was not renegotiation, not default, not the patient restructuring of obligations that modern finance has developed to manage exactly this kind of problem. The solution was arrest, torture, forced confession, and fire. He destroyed the institution that held his debt, seized its assets, and watched his obligations dissolve in the flames of the pyres on which the Templars burned. This is the story we are going to tell. But to tell it properly, to understand what was actually destroyed on that October morning, and why it mattered, and why it still matters, we need to go back much further. We need to go back to the beginning of the order itself, to the roads of the Holy Land, to the problem that gave birth to the Templars and the solution they invented. We need to understand what they built before we can understand what was taken from them. The year is 1119. The First Crusade has been over for 20 years. Jerusalem is in Christian hands, ruled by the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem established after the city's capture in 1099. Pilgrims from across Europe are making the journey to the holy sites, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, to Bethlehem, to the Jordan River, to all the places that the Christian faith had made sacred across 12 centuries of belief and devotion. And they are being robbed. The roads from the Mediterranean ports to Jerusalem are controlled, in the spaces between the Latin fortifications, by Muslim bandits and by opportunists of every faith and background who have recognized that the stream of wealthy European pilgrims represents an irresistible economic opportunity. Pilgrims are arriving at Jaffa or Acre after weeks at sea, carrying gold and silver to fund their journey and their offerings, and they are being killed or robbed before they can reach their destination. The roads of the Holy Land, in the years after the First Crusade, are among the most dangerous in the world. Into this situation step 9. French knights, led by a man named Hugo de Payens, who present themselves to Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, with a proposal. They will form a permanent military brotherhood devoted to the protection of the roads, knights who will patrol the pilgrimage routes, escort vulnerable travelers, and use their military training to suppress the banditry that is making the whole enterprise of Christian pilgrimage in the Holy Land so costly and so deadly. Baldwin gives them quarters in the royal palace, which was built on the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon. From this location they take their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. They are, in the beginning, genuinely poor. The 9 founding knights share horses. They take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the vows of monks, not knights. They are a military order in the most literal sense. Soldiers who are also monks. Warriors who are also brothers in a religious community. Men who dedicate themselves to violence in the service of the sacred. The combination is theologically awkward. The Church had always struggled with the question of whether killing could ever be holy, whether the soldier who spilled blood in God's name was a saint or a sinner, a crusader or a murderer in armor. The great Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential theologian of the 12th century, resolved this difficulty in the Templars' favor with a treatise called In Praise of the New Knighthood, written around 1130, in which he argued that the Templar knight was a new kind of being. Neither the secular knight who killed for glory and gold, nor the monk who renounced the world entirely, but a third thing, a warrior monk whose killing was purified by its sacred purpose. Bernard's endorsement was decisive. The Templars received formal papal recognition at the Council of Troyes in 1129, and with that recognition came privileges that would prove, in the long run, more transformative than any military victory. They were exempted from tithes. They were allowed to build their own churches. They were answerable only to the Pope, not to any local bishop or secular ruler. And they were permitted to receive donations of land, money, and property from anyone who wished to support their holy work. The donations came. They came from kings and nobles and merchants and ordinary believers across the whole of Christian Europe, from England and France and the Holy Roman Empire and the Iberian Peninsula and the Italian city-states. People gave land in Normandy and orchards in Provence, and houses in London and vineyards in Burgundy. They gave gold and silver. They gave their sons, their horses, their weapons, their prayers. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ became, within a generation of their founding, one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe. And wealth created a problem that the founding knights had not anticipated. Or rather, it created an opportunity that someone among them was clever enough to recognize and exploit. The problem was this. A pilgrim in London who wished to travel to Jerusalem could not carry his gold with him across France and the Mediterranean without extreme risk of robbery or loss. The roads were dangerous. Pirates operated in the Mediterranean. A man who set out from England with the resources for a year-long pilgrimage might arrive in the Holy Land penniless, robbed at every stage of the journey, or he might not arrive at all. The Templars had commanderies, fortified houses essentially, in London and Paris and Marseille and Acre and Jerusalem and dozens of places in between. They had members traveling constantly between these commanderies, carrying dispatches, managing accounts, transporting supplies. They had, in other words, a network. And someone, we do not know exactly who or exactly when, but it happened in the early decades of the 12th century, had the idea that this network could be used to solve the pilgrim's problem. A pilgrim could deposit his gold at the Templar commandery in London, receive a letter, a written document recording the amount deposited, encrypted against forgery, and travel to Jerusalem, carrying nothing more valuable than that letter. On arrival, he would present the letter to the Templar commandery in Acre or Jerusalem and receive the equivalent sum in local currency, minus a fee. This is the letter of credit. This is the bill of exchange. This is the instrument that makes international trade possible without the physical movement of precious metal across dangerous distances. In the 21st century, this principle underlies every wire transfer, every international payment, every transaction conducted between parties in different countries using different currencies. The infrastructure is different. The principle is identical. The Templars did not invent the underlying concept. Merchants in the Islamic world and in China had used similar instruments for centuries, and Italian merchants in the same period were developing their own versions of the same idea. But in the context of medieval Europe, the Templar network was the first institution with the geographic reach, the organizational coherence, the physical security, and the reputation for trustworthiness necessary to make this system work at scale. They were the first European bank in any meaningful modern sense of that word. And they did not stop there. Having discovered that they could hold deposits and issue letters of credit, the Templars quickly understood the further possibilities of the position they occupied. If you hold large amounts of other people's money, and if those people do not all demand their money back at the same time, you have, at any given moment, a surplus of funds available that is not immediately required for anything. And surplus funds sitting idle in a vault are an opportunity. The Templars began to lend. They lent to pilgrims who needed funds for their journey. They lent to Crusader nobles who needed to finance military campaigns. They lent to kings who needed money for wars, for building programs, for the endless expenses of medieval governance. They charged interest, though they were careful, as a religious order, to structure their lending in ways that complied with the Church's prohibition on usury, using fees and exchange rate adjustments rather than explicit interest charges to generate their return. They also developed what we would today call the mortgage. A landowner who needed cash could pledge his land to the Templars as security for a loan. If he repaid the loan within the agreed term, he got his land back. If he failed to repay, the Templars took possession. Hundreds of estates across Europe came into Templar ownership this way. Absorbed from indebted nobles who had borrowed against their land and been unable to repay. They created checking accounts. A wealthy patron could deposit funds with the Templars and then draw on that account as needed, paying debts by having the Templars transfer funds directly to the creditor rather than handling cash himself. This is recognizably the same mechanism as the modern current account. Money held on deposit, available for transfer on instruction, managed by a third-party institution that keeps the records and executes the transactions. They innovated in currency exchange. Traveling through Europe meant moving through a patchwork of different currencies: English pounds, French livres, Italian florins, German marks, and dozens of local coinages of varying purity and weight. Converting between them was complicated, subject to manipulation, and a source of significant expense for any traveler or merchant. The Templars offered exchange services at their commanderies across Europe, with rates that, while not always favorable, were at least consistent and trustworthy, from an institution whose reputation for honesty was backed by its sacred character. By the mid-13th century, the Order of the Temple was operating what was, by any reasonable measure, the most sophisticated financial institution in the Western world. It had branches in every major city in Europe and the Levant. It managed the accounts of kings and popes. It held the crown jewels of England as security for royal loans. It served as the treasury of the French monarchy. The Paris Temple, the Templars' great fortified tower in Paris, was effectively the French national bank, holding royal revenues and managing royal expenditure under Templar supervision. This last detail is crucial. The French kings had, over the course of the 13th century, come to rely on the Templars not just as occasional lenders, but as the managers of their financial affairs. The Templar treasurer in Paris was, in practice, the French finance minister. Royal revenues flowed into the temple. Royal expenses were paid out from it. The Templars kept the books, managed the cash, and provided the credit that allowed the French monarchy to function. And the French monarchy borrowed. It borrowed for wars. It borrowed for crusades that never quite achieved their objectives. It borrowed for the construction of the Sainte-Chapelle, that jewel of Gothic architecture built by Louis IX to house the crown of thorns. It borrowed for the administrative costs of running an increasingly centralized and sophisticated royal government. It borrowed, across generations of kings, in amounts that accumulated into a burden that was becoming, by the end of the 13th century, genuinely frightening in its scale. Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, as he was known, a title that referred to his physical appearance rather than any quality of character, came to the throne in 1285. He was 27 years old, handsome, cold, and possessed of an intelligence that contemporaries found unsettling in its combination of legal sophistication and total moral ruthlessness. He had inherited a kingdom with a functioning administrative apparatus, significant military power, and debts to the Templars that had been accumulating for decades. Philip's reign was defined by his need for money. He needed it for the war with England over Gascony. He needed it for the war with Flanders, a long and expensive and ultimately unsuccessful attempt to bring the wealthy Flemish cities under French control. He needed it for the crusade that he periodically promised and never delivered. He needed it for the costs of his own court, which was large, expensive, and accustomed to luxury. He tried every available method of raising revenue. He taxed the clergy, provoking a furious confrontation with Pope Boniface VIII that lasted years and ended with the Pope's death. Under circumstances that some contemporaries attributed to the shock of his treatment at French hands during a confrontation at Anagni in 1303. He expelled the Jews from France in 1306 and seized their assets, a brutal piece of fiscal opportunism dressed in the language of religious purity. He debased the coinage, mixing base metal with silver and gold to stretch the royal supply of precious metal, generating inflation that the population paid for in the declining purchasing power of their money. None of it was enough. By the early years of the 14th century, Philip IV of France owed the Knights Templar a sum that modern historians have estimated, in terms of its relationship to the total economic output of France, at something equivalent to multiple billions of euros today. It was not a debt that could be repaid through normal royal revenue. It was not a debt that could be negotiated away or restructured on terms that the Templars would accept. It was a debt that had grown through decades of borrowing and unpaid interest on interest, into something that had taken on a life of its own, a financial obligation that threatened to define and constrain the French monarchy for generations to come. Philip needed a solution, and the solution he found was one that a certain kind of ruthless mind finds almost elegant in its simplicity. If you cannot pay the debt, destroy the creditor. The plan required preparation. It required, above all, the cooperation of the Pope, because the Templars were a papal institution, answerable only to Rome, and no secular king could arrest them without papal sanction, without provoking a crisis of legitimacy that might be worse than the debt itself. Philip needed a pope who would cooperate, and in 1305, through a combination of political pressure and outright manipulation of the conclave, he got one. Clement V, born Bertrand de Got, Archbishop of Bordeaux, was a Frenchman, a client of the French crown, and a man who understood from the moment of his election that his pontificate depended on the goodwill of Philip IV. He moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon, a city in Provence that was, while technically not French territory, effectively within the French sphere of influence. The Avignon papacy, which would last for most of the 14th century, through 7 successive popes, all French, all living in the shadow of French royal power, begins with Clement V, and with the deal he made, or the pressure he accepted, in relation to the Templars. Philip spent the years between 1305 and 1307 building his case. He accumulated accusations against the Templars, drawing on a reservoir of rumor, grudge, and imagination that had been building for years around any institution as wealthy, as secretive, and as powerful as the Order of the Temple. The charges were specific and lurid. That initiates into the order were required to spit on the cross, to deny Christ, to engage in obscene kisses and sexual acts with their fellow brothers, to worship an idol called Baphomet that was sometimes described as a head, sometimes as a cat, sometimes as a demon in human form. Were any of these charges true? Almost certainly not, or not in any systematic way. The Templar rule, the detailed code of conduct governing every aspect of life in the order, was one of the most rigorous and demanding documents of medieval religious life. The initiates who were arrested and tortured described initiation ceremonies that were, in the tortured confessions, exactly what Philip's lawyers needed them to describe. Torture reliably produces the confession that the torturer requires. But we should be careful not to be too categorical. The Templars, like any institution of their size and age, were not monolithic. There were hundreds of commanderies across Europe, thousands of members of varying degrees of commitment and virtue, a century and a half of institutional history that included the full range of human behavior. It is possible that in some commanderies, in some periods, practices had developed that deviated from the official rule. It is possible that the secrecy of the initiation ceremony, which was real, and which the Templars themselves acknowledged, had given rise to some of the rumors. What is not credible is that the systematic worship of a demon, or the universal denial of Christ, could have been practiced by an order of thousands of men across dozens of countries for nearly 2 centuries, without leaving any trace in the historical record beyond the confessions extracted under torture. The charges were instruments. They were designed to make the arrests legally and theologically defensible, to give Clement V the cover he needed to sanction the suppression of a papal institution, and to give Philip the moral vocabulary to present the seizure of Templar assets as an act of piety rather than theft. On October 13, 1307, the doors were broken down. What followed was 7 years of legal process, torture, and fire. The arrested Templars were interrogated. Tortured in most cases, since medieval judicial process regarded torture as a legitimate instrument for extracting truth from the accused. Many confessed to the charges under torture, then recanted when the torture stopped, then were tortured again. A significant number died in custody. Others, who had confessed and then maintained their confessions, were sentenced to life imprisonment. Those who had confessed and then recanted their confessions, who had, in the legal logic of the time, relapsed into heresy, were condemned to death. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, had confessed under torture in the first days after his arrest. For years he maintained that confession, apparently hoping that by cooperating he might preserve the order or at least save the lives of its members. In March 1314, 7 years after his arrest, he was brought to a scaffold outside Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris to hear his sentence read. Life imprisonment, as befitted a man who had confessed and not recanted. And then, in front of the assembled dignitaries of church and state, in front of the crowd that had gathered to witness the public humiliation of the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay did something that nobody had expected and that nobody present would ever forget. He retracted his confession. He declared, loudly and clearly, that the charges against the order were false, that the confessions had been extracted by torture, that the Templars were innocent of every accusation that had been made against them, and that the real crime was not theirs, but their persecutors. Then he was burned alive. He died, according to the chronicle accounts, with considerable composure, facing in the direction of Notre Dame, praying. The legend that attached itself to his death almost immediately was this, that from the flames de Molay cursed Philip IV and Clement V, summoning them both to appear before God within the year. Clement V died the following month, in April 1314, of a disease that had been troubling him for some time. Philip IV died in November of the same year in a hunting accident at 46. Whether de Molay actually spoke these words, whether the timing of the deaths is coincidence or something more, is not something that history can determine. What is certain is that the story was told and retold and believed, and that it tells us something important about how contemporaries understood what had happened, that they recognized, even if they could not say so openly, that an injustice had been done, and that the men who had done it had not profited from it as they had intended. Because the great irony of Philip's plan is that it did not work. Not financially. The Templar assets that Philip seized were not as liquid as he had hoped. The order's wealth was largely in land, in buildings, in equipment, in the complex web of obligations and accounts that constituted its financial operations. Liquidating these assets took time, generated legal disputes, and produced far less cash than Philip had anticipated. The Council of Vienne in 1312 formally dissolved the order and transferred most of its assets not to Philip but to the Knights Hospitaller, a rival military order that Philip had less leverage over than he had hoped. The French crown got some of the proceeds after years of litigation, but nothing like the windfall that had been the plan. And the debt that had made the whole operation necessary, was simply cancelled. Not repaid. Cancelled. The creditor was gone. The records were seized or destroyed, and the obligation that had been the engine of the entire catastrophe was erased by the erasure of the institution that held it. This is the modern lesson of the Templar suppression, and it is a lesson that has not lost its relevance in 700 years. The Templars had built something genuinely new. They had built a financial infrastructure that made the movement of wealth across vast distances possible without the physical transportation of precious metal. They had built systems of credit and deposit and exchange that reduced the friction of international commerce and pilgrimage to a degree that had never been achieved before in the Western world. They had built an institution whose trustworthiness was backed by its sacred character. Because who would dare to default on a debt to God's soldiers, whose depositors were pilgrims and crusaders, whose collateral was sometimes literally the Holy Land itself? And they had made the mistake of lending to a king. This is not a mistake unique to the Templars. It is one of the recurring patterns of financial history, from the medieval banking houses of Florence to the sovereign debt crises of the modern era. Banks lend to governments because governments are large, because they have revenue streams that look reliable, because the reputational and legal consequences of sovereign default are in theory enormous. And governments borrow from banks because banks have money, because the costs of war and administration always exceed the revenues of taxation, because the future always seems like a reasonable time to worry about repayment. And sometimes, when the debt becomes large enough, and the government powerful enough, and the creditor vulnerable enough, the government reaches for a solution that no modern legal framework permits, but that the logic of power has always made available. It makes the problem disappear by making the creditor disappear. Philip IV of France did not invent this solution. Rulers had been destroying their creditors since the first loans were made. What makes the Templar case distinctive is the scale of the operation, the sophistication of the legal machinery deployed to accomplish it, and the completeness of the destruction. This was not a simple default or a quiet repudiation. It was a systematic, theologically elaborated, papally sanctioned elimination of an entire institution, the most sophisticated financial institution in the medieval world, for reasons that were, at their core, financial rather than religious. The charges of heresy were the instrument. The debt was the motive. And yet the Templars left something behind that could not be seized or burned. The practices they had invented, the letter of credit, the bill of exchange, the deposit account, the mortgage, the transfer of funds across distances without the physical movement of money. These did not die with the order. They passed through the Italian banking houses that had been watching and learning and competing with the Templars for 2 centuries into the mainstream of European commercial practice. The Florentine bankers, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Medici, took up where the Templars had left off. The techniques refined in the Paris Temple and the Acre Commandery became the techniques of the Florentine counting house, and from there they passed into the banking systems of Amsterdam and London, and eventually into the global financial architecture that governs the movement of money in the 21st century. The bank that God built was destroyed by a king who could not pay his bills. But the ideas it contained were not destroyed. They were too useful, too powerful, too deeply embedded in the practical needs of a world that had discovered what could be achieved when money could move faster than horses, when a letter was as good as gold, when the network mattered more than the vault. Jacques de Molay burned on his scaffold in March 1314. Philip IV was dead by November. The Templar commanderies stood empty or passed to the Hospitallers, or became parish churches, or simply fell into ruin. The Paris Temple, that great fortified tower that had been the financial heart of France, survived for another 5 centuries before Napoleon had it demolished in 1808. Partly, it is said, because it had become a place of royalist pilgrimage, a site associated with a different kind of royal execution that had taken place nearby in 1793. But in the archives of the Italian banking houses, in the practice manuals of Florentine merchants, in the legal codes that were slowly developing to govern the new world of commercial credit, the ghost of the order lived on. Every time a letter of credit was issued, every time a bill of exchange changed hands, every time a deposit was made in one city and drawn in another, the system that the Templars had built was operating, stripped of its sacred character, stripped of its white mantles and red crosses, but functioning, still functioning, in the bones of a financial world that had inherited everything they invented and forgotten, almost entirely, who had invented it. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. 9 knights in a palace built on the ruins of Solomon's temple, sharing horses, taking vows of poverty, promising to protect the roads. They ended up building the roads that money travels on, and a king burned them for it.